Welcome r/Prorevenge. He ruined my sister's only birth experience, so I made sure he'd never forget her. Obligatory apology for formatting as I'm on mobile. Kinda my revenge, kinda my sister's, both of us really proud. This is gonna be long, so TL, doctor at bottom. Here's our cast. My sister, we'll call her Sarah for the story. Sister's ex-BF, Paul ex-BF's new wife, Jane ex-BF's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Doe oldest brother, Zeke our parents and me. When I was 14 and my oldest sister, Sarah, was 22, we found out that she was pregnant with Paul, her boyfriend of 4 years. They immediately got engaged, and they were really happy. For a time. Sarah had a horrible pregnancy, about 16 to 18 weeks, and the wonder of creating a human life evaporated within her. She developed hyperemesis, which, if you don't know, is really bad morning sickness. She was constantly in pain. She developed gestational diabetes, and just all around hated the experience. Around this time Paul, the then fiancé, started getting sick of the complaining. I believe the argument was, your body is built to do this, it can't be that bad. Sarah was due around Valentine's Day, and Paul's parents, Mr. and Mrs. Doe, were very excited, both about the grandkid and the fact that he could be born on a holiday. She was very against that and really hoped that her son wouldn't be born on a holiday, even one as small as Valentine's Day. Her birthday sometimes falls on Easter, and she hates it because it might make him feel that his day isn't very much about him. Well, Mrs. Doe says something like, well, if you name him Valentine or Valentino, then that'll make the day even more special to him. Again, sister hated the idea. She thought it was tacky, he'd be bullied for it, and just really didn't like the name Valentino. Paul loved it, but agreed to go with a more average name like Daniel or Jard. Fast forward to February, and she was ready to get this over with. Sarah had officially been put on bed rest, because while standing or walking her blood pressure took unexpected spikes and dips. I look back now, and goodness do I feel bad for her. She was doing her best to avoid giving birth on Valentine's Day because, again, she didn't want him born on a holiday. Unfortunately, births happen when they happen, and that baby was going to come on Valentine's Day, whether she wanted him to or not. I remember waiting out in the waiting room with my dad, brothers, and Paul, who couldn't stand to be in the delivery room because it was gross. I was so mad that he could have gone in, but wouldn't because he thought my sister was gross while giving birth, whereas I had to stay outside because I was too young to go in with my mom and other sister. Dad went home with the youngest 2 brothers while the oldest, Zeke, stayed to watch me because I refused to leave. 16 hours after Sarah went into labor, my little nephew was officially part of the family on the evening of Valentine's Day. Unfortunately, Sarah was not okay. She had to have an emergency cesarean section, and while doing the operation discovered that the back of her uterus, facing her spinal cord, had a very large and very severe, thankfully non-cancerous, tumor. When I say large, I mean it was twice the size of a standard uterus. The doctors were shocked and didn't understand why nobody had noticed it on an ultrasound. It accounted for her severe back pain and blood pressure issues. The doctors immediately went in for more surgery to remove the tumor, but sadly ended up having to perform a full hysterectomy. This meant that my nephew would be Sarah's only child. Now, while Sarah was in for surgery, Paul was taking care of everything baby related to make sure his son was okay. In my 14-year-old self's memory, I remember him being suitably distraught, but I didn't really pay him much mind, and spent my time in the waiting room with my mother and other sister. Zeke, however, wanted to be a good future brother-in-law and make sure that Paul was okay. He found Paul filling out the baby paperwork on his own, looking, in my brother's words, like he had not a single worry in his mind. Zeke asked why Paul didn't wait for Sarah to fill out the paperwork, as she should have been put of surgery within the hour, and Paul said that he just wanted her to get her rest and heal. That checked out with Zeke, as he was 16 and didn't know any better at the time. Now I know what you're probably thinking. No, he wouldn't. He knows how much she hates that name. And still, she'd need to sign the paperwork too. My fellow peoples of Reddit, I regret to inform you that Paul forged Sarah's signature on the paperwork and waited until she was out of surgery to hand said paperwork over. My sweet nephew, that was born on Valentine's Day, was named Valentino on his first official birth certificate. I still to this day don't know why Paul and his family were so insistent about the name. He had even picked out a different one with my sister. And before you ask, no, he was never brought up on forgery charges because his parents were witnesses to her signing the papers, even though they only got there at the last minute. So Sarah dumped him and got her son's name changed a month later. She was willing to do split custody with him because that's her son's father and she wants the kid to know him. But Paul vanished and she never heard anything back, which seemed weirdly out of character to us. Until a mutual friend on Facebook was tagged in his wedding picture 6 months later. Paul had apparently started cheating on her not long after she got pregnant. Sarah was livid, but there wasn't much she could do, so she filed for child support and continued to live her best life. Until 6 years later. This is where the revenge starts, my friends. So Sarah has been a single mother for the past 6 years and has been amazing at it. At this point in my career I've been a hairdresser for about 8 months at our local Great Clips. I'm working one day, and who is seated before me but Jane, Paul's wife, herself. I take her back for a trim, and she clearly has no idea who I am. That adds up, because a mutual friend that still keeps in contact with Paul said that Jane doesn't know a thing. She has no idea about Sarah, that she was the other woman, or that Paul actually has a kid that he's been, infrequently, paying child support for. She's in the dark on it all. I told myself not to be an ass and treat her like a normal customer, which I did. Now at this point, Jane was heavily pregnant, so a lot of our conversation was about that. She loved being pregnant, but it was hard. Her husband was so unsympathetic, big shocker, and she was due in 10 weeks, and they still hadn't picked out a name for their baby girl. Ladies and gentlemen, this was my chance. I asked what kind of name she was looking for, and she said I want something unique and unusual, but not ridiculous like Brainlay, you know the ones I'm talking about, and Paul had suggested so many already, and she didn't like any of them. So I, conniving little weasel I am, said what about Sarah? My sister's name isn't actually Sarah, she was named after an older family member that passed not long after she was born, but there was no female equivalent for his name, so our parents created one. It's a beautiful name and just what Jane was looking for. She loved it, she stuck by it, and I found out, by stalking her Facebook months later, that she had put her foot down about it, and that was their daughter's name. Now Paul has a daughter with his ex's name, to remind him every day about her, and to also remind him to pay his child support. Little nephew is 10 years old now with a new name, and no contact with his biological father, though we do still sometimes call him Val as a family nickname. He likes it, but doesn't want to bring it to school, so it's staying a family nickname. Sarah pretends to hate when we call him that, in a joking way. As long as he likes it, she doesn't have a problem with it. And she's seeing a new guy who's really great, and like a father to Val. Close bracket. TL. Doctor, my sister's baby daddy forged her signature on paperwork while she was in surgery to name their son a name that she had been avidly against from the beginning, then broke all contact when she dumped him and married the girl he was cheating on her with while she was pregnant. 6 years later I meet his wife and convince her to name her daughter my sister's name because the wife has no idea my sister and her son exist. I know someone whose husband did this for their youngest 2 out of 4 children. He worked for the hospital in an administrative role, so they let him do it while she was recovering. The son got renamed a few days later to what they had agreed on, but the daughter's name grew on her and was kept. Lady divorced him after much encouragement for everyone around her, including her Catholic priest. He was abusive, but she wasn't going to leave him until the priest talked to her. He would send her and the kids east to spend 6 weeks every summer visiting her family and his, then immediately move his mistress into their home. She'd come home to her stiff in the garage more than once. He insisted they attend all his running events as a family, but they weren't allowed to approach him, and he wouldn't acknowledge them. He tried to claim he was paying for oldest daughter's college, so that should lower his child support for the other 3, but oldest daughter found out and sent a letter to both lawyers and the judge stating that he forced her to work holidays and summers to pay for her own tuition and sent bank records as he made too much for her to qualify for financial aid. He ended up back paying tuition, continuing to pay, and paying full child support. Had to buy her a new car because a family 6 had spent several years driving around in a 5-person car. He also forced a clause that the custodial parent would have 24 hours to notify the other parent if one of the 2 underage daughters ended up pregnant. Guess who got to make that call? Same thing happened to me. My biological father named me after his dad, while my mom was passed out after the birth, forged signature and all. Unfortunately, she didn't divorce him right there. She waited until I was 6 to do that. Apparently, however, I always hated that name and chose a nickname that was barely related to my birth name. So I didn't have to use it much except for legal forms, but god I hated it when I did use it. I legally changed my full name at 18, after he refused to sign papers to let it happen at 16. When I submitted those papers at the court, it was a great day, very freeing. That's amazing. My dad did the same paper forging crap, only he chose to name me after 2 women he had been cheating with. That was his punishment for my mom not having a boy, like it was up to her or something. He desperately wanted a son. She finally left him 5 years later, when his mistress was pregnant. They had a son. He got to name him the boy name he had wanted to give to me, and then they put him up for adoption not long after. He later went on to name his next daughter the cultural/family name that was meant for me. She's not even part of that culture. There's no real happy ending there, unfortunately.